All right, so welcome everyone. And it is with great pleasure today that I get to introduce Dr. Chris Schell. I've known Chris since we were grad students in Chicago. And one of the things that's always struck me about his work is the creativity with which he approaches urban carnivore behavior and ecology, and the ways in which he works at the interface of science and society to really push the boundaries of EEB and environmental justice. And Chris is currently an assistant professor of urban ecology at the University of Washington, Tacoma. But this July, he'll be moving his lab south to UC Berkeley, where he'll be an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, please type them in the chat box, and I'll moderate uh, a Q&A at the end of the talk, and you'll also be able to use the raise hand function then. So we're excited to have you here today, Chris. We can't wait to hear what you have to share with us, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Shane, for the introduction. Thank y'all for allowing me to wrap with y'all for a little bit. And I'm super excited to share some of the recent work that we've been putting together that makes these links between ecology and evolution and environmental justice, and makes the links those that are clear, but also is really a call to action for us to be not only better stewards of our science, but to be better stewards as people, and think about how we lead with justice, how we lead with equity and scholar activism in our own networks and what that means. So I've titled today the Socio-eco-evo dynamics, exploring how society shapes the biology of cities. And many of you, it's funny, I know quite a few of you already at University of Michigan, and including some of the collaborators I'm going to give a shout out to here today that contributed to some of this work. But y'all know, like when I'm giving talks, I oftentimes like to lead with narratives. I believe that science communication, the best form of communication is through stories, through the narratives of the animals or the people that we work with. Today will be no different. And also, I'm a psychology major from undergrad, so I use a lot of cognitive heuristics to make links between some of the material that many of you already know to some of the material you may not know, right? And making that link substantive in a way that we can think about it deeply beyond the work that we've already been doing. So let's start here with Chicago and a narrative that was at the beginning of my graduate work at the University of Chicago. So in 2008, this coyote here, which again, these photos are real, they're not Photoshopped. This is an actual story of an actual coyote. A coyote in 2008 walks into a Quiznos in downtown Chicago, then proceeds to hop into the drink cooler of that Quiznos, looks around, and slowly starts to fall asleep in the drink cooler for a full 45 minutes. The folks that are eating their sandwiches, the folks that are behind the counter making their sandwiches, they all stop what they're doing. They're like, I don't want any of this smoke. And they slowly walk out of the establishment until animal control comes to relocate that animal. For me, having this be at the beginning of my graduate career, I was always interested in animal behavior. And then now I had this question: why is it that this one individual, and maybe several others related to this individual, make the decision to walk into a Quiznos relative to counterparts that did not make that decision? Fast forward to the more recent past. This photo is of two raccoons in a Chase bank. Yes, the bank was locked in Redwood City, California, but they're raccoons. They found their way in. I like to think that the inner dialogue between these two individuals is that the one on the right is thinking, oh, snap, we've been caught on camera. We got to get out of here. And the one on the left is like, I'm not leaving until I get what's mine. So, again, this example highlighted for me, there are these individual organisms that, if we expand all the way up to the population within cities, are finding ways to survive and thrive in these human dominated environments that were previously thought of as inhospitable. Certainly, if I were to take all of the examples of urban wildlife from 2008 to 2021, it would extend beyond the time that we have for this conversation for today. So certainly there's something there, right? And individual variation was the way that, for me, led the path to trying to understand how we build these integrative links. So I want you to hold that individual variation narrative for right now as we get into the big premise of today's talk, that premise being that social inequality is an ecological issue. And as such, injustices that shape our natural landscapes are also being shaped by our social landscapes and vice versa. Now, the best way to start thinking about these issues and how they are intertwined is through this first avatar, this handsome Adonis right here, Jeff Goldblum, who in the original Jurassic Park movie, which I'm assuming all of y'all have seen it by now, and if you're not, yeah, if you haven't, you have homework to do, right? Ian Malcolm's character comes in as the chaos theorist and starts talking about how life finds a way, in allusion to the dinosaurs breaking out of what were thought to be these ironclad man-made enclosures to keep dinosaurs in, right? We all know this story. Dinosaurs win the day. Well, in urban systems, I also like to think that life is finding a way, dot, 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 in cities. So much so that we are seeing across the globe in many different cities, different organisms finding ways to not only survive in these human dominated environments, but thrive in those environments. Everything from urban smooth coated otters here in Singapore to raccoons in the Pacific Northwest and everything in between. What's interesting is that recent conceptual pieces, perspectives, syntheses, and empirical works are starting to look at how environmental variation driven by people is resulting in that very important individual variation we talked about at the top of this talk, right? So things like changes in temperature due to urban heat island effects, or maybe anthropogenic light at night, or food subsidies are influencing the very variation that's important to influencing fitness of these organisms in these urban environments. To the point which we're seeing urban and non-urban populations diverging from each other and becoming locally adapted to the stressors that they are experiencing. What's important to note here is that humans are the directors and the audience of this screenplay. I like to joke that we are the Lin-Manuel Miranda of this joint. Not only did we cast all of the cast members, not only did we compose all of the songs, we even put together the rotating stage. We also are acting in this play. We also are watching it as it unfolds. And as it unfolds, we purposefully, continuously are editing back and forth. This reciprocal adaptation, which oftentimes is thought of as human animal or human wildlife interactions, and then by virtue, human wildlife conflict, right, is epitomized in this photo of this buck who has decided that he has had enough of this people's dribble, right? He's not taking it anymore and is accosting, likely was also being accosted by this bystander who got way too close. So we can imagine and build predictions, right? Any kind of animal behaviorist will say, well, what about the developmental experiences of this animal? Yeah, that's a good place to start because chances are, as a youngin, that this individual was probably maybe fed, maybe it was seen but not chased. Maybe the number of predators in this relative environment are gone. So then, as an adult, you not only expect food from people, but you start saying, like, no, nah, this is my territory. If you don't bounce, then I'm going to bounce you. So this all kind of gets to this idea of socio-eco-evo dynamics, this idea that society influences the ecology and evolution of species that then comes back to society through nature's contributions to people. So much so that, say, the influence of politics in the economy, or transportation and infrastructure, or land resource use management all influence the very things that we study: habitat modification, connectivity, preference and selection, that influence ecology at every level and evolution therein. Not only that, we can see these examples happening in real time through multiple case studies that we surveyed in a recent paper in Evolutionary Applications. Specifically, one of the papers that we reviewed was from Katz et al. In 2019, where they took a look at the distribution of mosquitoes and their life history traits as a function of social and economic heterogeneity within the city. Now, they take a look at mosquito populations in the city of Baltimore, and they notice that urban habitat, specifically standing water, which is great for mosquitoes, right? That's where they breed, impervious surfaces like concrete and asphalt, And the relative distribution of predators, which in areas that have greater impervious surfaces, they tend to negatively influence predator abundance. All of that positively influences reproduction, body size, and growth rate of those mosquitoes in areas that have higher impervious surface cover. Guess where those areas are? In lower income neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore. So that means that mosquitoes in those low income neighborhoods are reproducing at a greater clip, their body sizes are bigger, and they grow faster. All of those factors influence and contribute to, say, the susceptibility or the risk of catching a zoonose from a mosquito. So that means low income residents tend to have greater proximity to mosquito-borne diseases than others. So you imagine, cool, awesome. Then that means that all the pest management strategies should be co-located in those low-income neighborhoods, right? Nope, because society doesn't work like that. So what recent studies have shown is that the application of pest management strategies is like the rich getting richer. Most of the wealthy neighborhoods in US cities across again this nation are getting most of the pest management services, whereas those that are in mixed or low income areas are not getting those services. So imagine the incomplete versus the relatively more complete application of those insecticides. An incomplete insecticide application is likely to lead to insecticide resistance that accelerates these population dynamics, making the susceptibility to disease greater in those low income areas. Not only that, we can build predictions and conceptual ideologies to try and understand how the scale of the city, the predictability of interacting with that species, and the ecological level at which we interact with a species influences how they adapt, whether the response we see is plastic or genetic, whether or not the selection pressure on that individual is weak or strong, and if the process in and of itself of change in those populations is very slow or very fast. So you can imagine, even within yourself, for all of y'all that are listening on to this call, right? The way in which you perceive ants and their potential threat to your livelihood is very different than the way in which you perceive mountain lions and their threat to your livelihood. And that perception of the animals across different locales, whether it be local, state, federal, or across countries, influences the way in which we then perceive and manage those animals in kind. So again, those two examples I just bring out for you to show how important it is to integrate society into eco-evo processes. But before we get any more into the weeds, I think it's important to note that we are all talking about the significance of structure in driving many of these processes. And by structure here specifically, I provide to you a photo of a cherry blossom tree on UW Seattle's campus. The reason being is because I want you to think about the relative proportion of trees and green space to other built structures in an urban environment. And hence, I want you to follow the trees. Yes, not this tree, but you get the point, right? Cognitive links. I want you to follow the trees in this next slide, where I'm going to show you a side-by-side comparison of two neighborhoods that are no more than a half mile apart from each other here in the Pacific Northwest. All right. So the photo on the left is of this township called University Place, which is to the southwest of the downtown Tacoma region. The photo on the right is of southeast Tacoma. Again, these two neighborhoods are no more than a half mile apart from each other. So if I were to ask you, and again, you're following the trees, all of y'all are being Groot, right? I am Groot. If you're following the trees, and I were to ask you, all right, y'all, which of these two neighborhoods would you expect to have greater vegetation cover? That question is easy, right? You probably look at the two, and even if you are colorblind, you would be able to see, yeah, University Place here on the left certainly has greater tree canopy cover and greater vegetation cover. I mean, even the lots are bigger, right? I'm like, all right, cool. That was the easy one. Then I ask you, all right, which of these two neighborhoods would you expect to have a higher median household income? If you've grown up anywhere in a city, really across the globe, you wouldn't flinch at the answer to that question either. You probably would say the photo on the left. of University Place. This intrinsic idea that there's a relationship between socioeconomic wealth and species richness and biodiversity, it has a name. It's called the luxury effect. This idea that species richness and biodiversity are often positively associated with wealth. Now, here's the thing, right? Caveat a little bit. Later on in this talk, we're going to start to disentangle the idea of socioeconomic wealth predicting everything, because it really doesn't. And there are reasons why we need to dig deeper beyond the proxy of socioeconomic wealth. But before we get into any of that, for those of you where this is the first time you've heard of the luxury effect, I've done you a solid. Here's a literature review of most of the studies that have taken a look at how wealth structures ecological communities worldwide, from primary producers all the way up to tertiary consumers. So things like tree species diversity, native tree abundance, greater overall vegetation diversity, to arthropod diversity, to lizard and bird species richness, all the way up to mammalian occupancy, are all influenced by the way in which socioeconomic wealth and gradients are also influenced. But y'all notice, right? Like mammals, they're a little scant up top. Arthropods are too. So for those of you that study invertebrates, wide open for you. But I'm a mammologist, so I'm asking the questions, well, do these effects abound for mammals, not just in one city, like Magley et al. Did in 2016, but across cities? So of late, through the Grit City Carnivore Project, which is this collaborative network between UW-Tacoma, Point Defiance Zoo and Aquarium, and Metro Parks Tacoma, as well as the Urban Wildlife Information Network, this larger collaborative of researchers that work for cultural or community institutions like zoos and museums, academic institutions, government institutions, and the like, use these remote triggered camera traps as well as several other techniques to understand the behavior and the ecology of urban mammals and other urban species within our cities. To give you a bird's eye view of what that looks like for us here in Tacoma, we've been monitoring urban mammals since fall of 2018. And here is just a map of where we have had or currently have camera traps throughout the city of Tacoma, with many other camera traps extending beyond this map. So at any given seasonal block, we have 29 to 36 cameras out per month block. Those month blocks being October, which is our fall field season, January, which is our winter field season, April, which is our spring field season, and in July, our summer field season. Some of y'all may be asking, well, why do you have such an arbitrary number, 29 to 36 cameras? Well, we do a pretty darn good job hoping to get 36 cameras. But for those of you that work in urban ecosystems, you know, like you're working in an urban ecosystem, meaning you're trying to mitigate damage from abiotic effects like wildfires. You're trying to mitigate damage from wildlife. So we've had a couple of raccoons try and pry open the metal lockbox of our cameras, and we have the claw marks to show it. But 99.9% of all the damage is human related. So we go through this really interesting evolutionary arms race where we put out a camera with a lock, the lock gets cut by a set of bolt cutters. We put out another camera with a heavy dutier lock, a heavy dutier set of bolt cutters come out to take the camera, and we go back and forth and back and forth. So, you know, ecological data is messy. But when we do get everything right, then we get photos that look like this. So we have the traditional wildlife ecology photos. Many of you, for instance, you already have, say, Dr. Naima Harris in the building who does this work as well, right? Where in the top left photo, we have, say, a black-tailed deer posing for their first day of school photo. We have raccoons kind of moving through one of the environments. Here is coyote and opossum checking out the lure that's in front of the camera so that we just get it in the cone of detection. My personal favorite of all of the photos we've taken so far is this one. Is about 5 blocks away from UW-Tacoma's campus, and these raccoons are just practicing their parkour. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 right there. Maybe 5 that got a little bit higher in the tree. This little dude is my favorite though. He's hanging on. Cameras are not only good for still images, they're also good for video. And I should have warned y'all, right? I studied charismatic megafauna, so you know I'm going to hit you upside the head with a lot of it. And this is one of them. Bobcat Kit just like posing in one of our sites. Notice here the timestamp and the date for this Bobcat Kit video, March 9th, 2020. So one of the recent analyses that we've been conducting of late is for many of our cities in the UN network, we have been able to collect data during stay-at-home orders. So we have data before the pandemic and data during the pandemic, and we can assess whether or not there are any changes in temporal activity as a function of stay-at-home orders. But that's for the sequel. Y'all can come to the sequel. Today, we're still sticking with the luxury effect analysis. And in this next slide, I'm going to show you two of our preliminary data sets from Seattle and Tacoma proper. So the figure at the top is for Seattle. The figure at the bottom is for Tacoma. Both of the x-axes are income scaled by a cost of a one-bedroom apartment. And the y-axis is species richness, just the number of species we're able to detect on our cameras. Briefly, each of these point estimates were extracted from the posterior distribution of our Bayesian occupancy model. And these point estimates, we were then able to capture their 95% confidence intervals from that posterior distribution. So these confidence intervals are just noting we do have seasonality in the species we're able to detect. For instance, in the fall, we tend to have our highest detections of most of the species in Seattle and Tacoma in that season. But in the winter, it completely tails off. So these error bars, right, these confidence intervals are taking into account all that error. And after we get all those point estimates from that posterior distribution, then we can look at the Pearson correlation between species richness and income. And even in cities as green as Seattle and Tacoma, we are still seeing that income predicts species richness in urban mammals. Now, mind you, I'm only bringing out Seattle and Tacoma. So we are working on an analysis right now with 20 other cities in the UN network, some of which don't have this relationship at all, some of which have a more stronger relationship. And the reasons why oftentimes have to do with the way in which the city was built. But before we get into that, it should be noted that up to this point, we've talked all about the biotic factors of the environment, so the living components of the city. But we haven't talked at all about the abiotic or the non-living components of the city. And yes, luxury effects also persist for those abiotic factors as well, which, cue the obligatory Avatar Last Airbender drop. Again, if y'all haven't already started a list of things you need to watch this weekend, here you go, add this to the list. I know for those of you that are fans, I'm stretching the Earth analogy here a little bit, but we kind of already talked about Earth, right? And luxury effects influencing Earth, like these living things. But luxury effect also influence water and air and fire. So let's get to the figurative fire, that figurative fire being urban heat island effects. So briefly, urban heat island effects denote that cities tend to be anywhere from 3 to 10 degrees hotter than their rural counterparts. The main reason being the relative proportion of impervious surfaces, again, think concrete, asphalt, building densities, relative to the amount of green space or tree canopy cover or vegetation cover, which influences a whole suite of processes, including heat absorption and retention, plant transpiration and water evaporation from the soil, and water penetration. Now, here's what's interesting. If we were to take a map of a city and then look at the average surface level temperature at each census block, then compare that to the median household income for each census block, you'll get a map that looks a whole awful lot like this. Now, for those of you that are currently in Michigan, right? Like y'all may be remote and not in Michigan, but for those of you that are actually in Michigan, living in Michigan, if you go to this resource right here, provided by NPR, you'll get a map that looks like a map of Detroit, right? Depending on where you are, you'll get a map of the closest city that you're in that shows something very similar to this, where it tends to be the hottest for average surface level temperatures, also tends to be the lowest median household income. Again, not by accident. If you're being Groot and you're following the trees, then you're like, there aren't nearly as many trees relative to, say, areas like this compared here, which is influencing environmental cooling in those regions. Okay, so what about air? Well, several studies of late have shown how air pollution inequity disproportionately influences Black and Brown communities across multiple US cities. But one of the studies that I wanted to pull out for y'all published in Nature Sustainability by Tessam et al. In 2019, takes a look at this pollution inequity index that they create, that is the relative proportion of consumption of goods that generates air pollution relative to the amount of air pollution burden that you're experiencing. Here's the thing. Here's what's artful about this study, is that they control for differences in income gradients in order to look specifically at racial ethnic breakdowns. And they look from 2000 all the way to 2015 at data across multiple US cities. So if you are below this zero line threshold, then that means that you are generating more air pollution via the consumption of goods than you are experiencing that air pollution burden. Whereas here, if you're above the zero line threshold, then that means that you are experiencing more air pollution burden than you are generating that air pollution via the consumption of goods. This pale blue line right here is for white Americans. This green line is for Black Americans. This orange line is for Latinx Americans. And these data are already outdated. So if we were to take a look at 2016 on to 2021, I bet this wouldn't really change all that much. So thinking about, again, controlling for income, we're starting to chip away a little bit about the luxury effect. There's something else going on here where air pollution inequity is not being proportionately experienced by all folks that live in a city. Air pollution inequity is perhaps one of the most topical of the 4 elements in this avatar section because of the fact that it's both linked to who contracts and dies from COVID, as well as it's going to be exacerbated by the influence of climate change. So a recent paper that was published by Kimberly Terrell and colleagues looks along a stretch of land of the Mississippi River called Cancer Alley. Y'all may be asking, why is it called Cancer Alley? Well, after emancipation during Southern Reconstruction, this is again when Jim Crow systems were kind of in full blast, residential segregation by race was on, and many statues to Confederate monuments were put up here, right? So many of these communities are predominantly Black along this stretch of land. It's also no accident that many of these communities are proximally located to industrial sites, toxic waste sites, and pollutants. To this day, Louisiana as a state has one of the most relaxed policies for EPA regulations against air pollution. So there's still a bunch of air pollution that's being drummed up, which leads to these current contemporary maps. Also, then, unfortunately, it is not a coincidence that those that are dying at disproportionate rates of COVID, even though they don't represent nearly as much of the population as white Americans do in Louisiana, they are still dying more because they live in areas that are ravaged by air pollution hazard. A more recent view into the wildfires here in California. If y'all remember, all along the West Coast, there were wildfires that made the skies look like we were on Mars. Washington was not nearly as bad as California, and it was still bad. There were still a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks where we were unable to go outside without being in the air for 10 minutes and then wheezing like we had asthma. Right? This photo was taken from the San Francisco Bay Area about 6 months ago. For those of you that are movie buffs, this photo on the right is from Blade Runner 2049 with Ryan Gosling. Now, most of y'all would probably say you'd rather be with Ryan Gosling in most scenarios. I don't blame you. But for real though, like Blade Runner doesn't look as bad as San Francisco does in this photo. So these issues are ones that we are going to have to face and are already facing right now, and building strategies that pinpoint the areas of most need, i.e. using an environmental justice lens to understand how the ecology of our systems is being impacted by our societal decisions. And notice here, it's not our as in the royal we, it's really kind of more like whoever has the power and the privilege to make those decisions. We need to start dismantling, deconstructing, and really destroying systems of oppression in order to fully address these issues. Finally, these photos don't need much caption. Y'all live in this state, right? You have probably been to, and if you haven't, it's skip, hop, and a jump away from you. Flint, Michigan, and the Flint, Michigan water crisis to this day, which has not seen full justice been afforded to the constituents of Flint, Michigan. And I bring this example up for us to start chipping away at luxury effects being the only thing that is kind of predicting this influence of society on biology and biodiversity. Because here in this example, we had government officials make decisions that degraded the environment here, access to clean water for some communities relative to others. And Flint, Michigan isn't all low income, right? There are folks that live in Flint that would be considered mixed income or middle class. And yet decisions made by a few endangered the many. So when we start to chip away at the luxury effect, it's important to note that as we start to see these meta-analyses similar to this one here by Kiras et al. In 2020, it's necessary to see them side by side and say, are we seeing all studies, all empirical works showing this positive effect where wealth increases, biodiversity increases, or are we seeing a neutral effect where maybe there's no influence of socioeconomic wealth on the number of species we can detect at all? Or maybe there's the opposite effect, this negative effect where wealth, increasing wealth, predicts decreases in richness and biodiversity. What this study did was they took flora and fauna, separated the studies between those two classes. Then they looked at land use consideration from residential to non-residential, as well as density of the city. Think Manhattan versus Los Angeles, right? Super dense versus not so dense, but certainly still urbanized. And yeah, sure, you can make a case that the proportion of cases for flora and fauna are positive in residential areas. But in mixed residential, non-residential, and in non-residential areas, that ain't the case anymore. When you look at dense to sparse, also not clear cut, which means that we need to dig a little bit deeper. We need to understand the contributors and the relative contributions to the influence that we see in urban biodiversity. Which means what is influencing these socioeconomic gradients in the first place, right? We need to think about how we dismantle and understand structural racism and classism and their bottom-up projections on all of the landscape heterogeneities that we just talked about. So I and several of our colleagues, including again, Dr. Naima Harris, who was on this paper with us, talk about how impervious surface cover, urban heat island effects, green space and tree cover, environmental pollutants, resource distribution, and disease dynamics are influenced by things like residential segregation, resource allocation, gentrification, which then has projections to the eco-evo patterns and processes therein. Now, up to this point, we've been talking a lot about urban systems, but best believe it doesn't just stay in urban systems. There's no place on this planet that the human footprint, whether directly or indirectly, is not touching it. So the way in which we treat each other is the way in which we treat our natural landscapes. And if we're highly inequitable, then yeah, the rest of the planet's going to be highly inequitable. Good luck conserving biodiversity without thinking about the ways in which we treat each other equitably and with justice. Which leads me to one of the societal policies in the United States that has been one of the most widespread, pervasive, insidious, and still to this day has ecological effects that we can see on our contemporary landscape. That policy being redlining. So for those of you that have not heard redlining before, it was this systematic denial of various services to residents of specific, often racially associated neighborhoods or communities, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. What does that mean? Well, in practice, it looks a little bit like this. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, backed by our US government, created maps that were color-coded from green to red, where these green and blue regions, designated A and B, were considered to be the desirable neighborhoods that you wanted to live in. This was all code. Desirable just essentially meant wealthy and white. You wanted to be in those areas. Whereas the yellow and the red, which respectively are C and D regions, were deemed unhazardous or unfit to live in. Guess who were in those neighborhoods? Black and brown folks and low-income communities that were proximally located to many toxic waste sites and industrial pollutants. There are stories from our elders and ancestors that talk about not only official US sanctioned ways that made sure that those neighborhoods were segregated by race, but also unofficial ways as well. So, for instance, many cities would enshrine these A and B regions by making them sundown towns. If you don't know what a sundown town is, essentially it was if you were caught in one of those neighborhoods and you were a person of color, specifically if you were black, caught in a neighborhood after sunset, you'd be lynched on sight like that, right? There are also other unofficial policies, like for instance, even if you had the economic mobility to move into those neighborhoods, banks would deny you loans from getting into those neighborhoods. Housing agents would spy on potential black residents and then report all of their spying work to authorities. And then say you got through all of that and you still bought a house, you'd have a burning cross in your front yard, courtesy of the KKK. So many of those policies were kind of enshrined in and outside of official and unofficial law. If you want to learn more about the history of redlining, I have two resources for you today. The first being The Color of Law, written by Richard Rothstein. The second being the University of Richmond's Mapping and Equality Project. Now, they have a lot of research, not only on redlining, but also on urban renewal, gentrification and displacement, and several other societal policies, official or unofficial, that have led to the displacement of people of color. But I bring these maps up to highlight something very important. Number one, I started with 61 and I ended with 108, meaning that there are more maps before this and there are more maps after this. If you grew up anywhere in a city in America, you probably have a map that looks like this for you. Number two, as ecologists and evolutionary biologists, we can build predictions of these maps based on where we know resources likelier to be, given the legacy effects of these cities. So from Tacoma to San Francisco to Oakland and Seattle, I pull out these four because that's where I do the majority of my work. I can build predictions based off of where these blue and green areas are and say, well, would we expect source or sink dynamics or populations to be co-located in the C and D or A and B regions? Or maybe the greatest amount of refugia, right? So just tons of plant life, environmental heterogeneity is in those blue and green regions. Maybe native species biodiversity is also highest in those areas as well. If I'm an animal moving across the landscape and I'm trying to find prime habitat, I'm probably looking for those areas that are older and more established, have greater diversity in, say, food items. Or maybe I'm thinking about what's the kind of proximity to pollutants. Maybe they're still high in these red and yellow areas. So what are the organismal effects of being in these environments? All of these predictions ain't coming out of nowhere. There are already studies taking a look at how redlining influences the ecological patterns and processes of our cities. So a recent preprint that was put together by Dexter Locke and Company, as well as Stuart Pickett and several others, took a look at tree canopy cover across these A through D graded regions, again, A being green, D being red. And in almost every single city, A regions tend to have customarily greater tree canopy cover, and in some instances, B areas do as well, relative to the C and D areas. I'm just going to stop for a second and provide some context, y'all. Like, redlining was abolished in 1968. That was more than 50 years ago, and we're still to this day seeing the effect of redlining on our natural ecosystems. So we can then try and understand and build predictions on how society, racial inequality, systemic oppression, and racism contribute to the way in which our natural systems operate. And then it gives us areas to pinpoint to really do restoration in an equitable way. So hopefully now at this point, I've convinced y'all that social inequality is an ecological issue. And by that same token, then, environmental justice and anti-racism are perhaps the most important, I would argue, the baseline for any urban conservation and sustainability work. And we don't even need the qualifier. Any conservation and sustainability work, period. We need to lead with environmental justice and anti-racism, which means thinking about how do we deconstruct systems of oppression? How do we reconcile past ills? And how do we mobilize communities to allow us to amplify and relinquish our privilege to those that have less power and privilege, so then that way they can speak their truths. Should be noted, I'm giving a talk invited by the University of Michigan on this seminar, but I am not going to be the last person to talk about this, nor was I the first. Environmental health is a prerequisite for civil rights, has been talked about for quite a long time. So much so that, taking lessons from the past, we need to learn about how do we do this now as we face climate crises, economic collapse, war. And maybe rather than think of conservation success as just translocation success, reproductive success, large populations, thinking about how we build equitable capital and fight poverty as conservation success. And yes, that's not just urban areas, that's non-urban areas as well. So say, for instance, increasing affordable housing will potentially lead to greater ecological stability via reduced displacement of peoples that then reduces overall ecological disturbances. Increasing accessible healthcare allows for, say, creating strategies where more folks have access to green spaces, more folks have access to reliable healthcare, and more folks have access and the privilege to be able to want to take care of their environments, right? In ways that allow them the access and the privilege that they so rightly deserve. That then begets ecosystem health, which helps out the health of all other non-human organisms in the city. All the way down to strengthening voting rights, which I would argue is perhaps the most important piece, to amplify greater diversity of voices so all folks are able to contribute to this conversation and this narrative. And it needs to happen like yesterday, because we done run out of time now, right? Some of y'all may be asking, well, I don't do conservation biology. Maybe I study protein chain or a couple of alleles that are really deeply embedded in a system that's not urbanized at all. Well, guess what? We're all in academia. So we all have a responsibility to amplify those that are customarily not amplified in our science. So that's part of the reason why we came together to put together our Recreating Wakanda piece in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, to center the conversation about how we abolish anti-Black racism in ecology and evolution and amplify Black excellence in ecology and evolution as well. That means thinking about leaving white fragility at the door, being okay with being uncomfortable, right? Practicing anti-racist strategies everywhere, not just in some places here or there, making sure that JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, is mandated at conferences that you go to, not just a sideshow. And then on the other side, amplifying Black excellence means hiring Black faculty, making sure that they get tenure, right? Being in the positions that allow them to make the decisions to bring in more faculty of color. Position Black scholars as keynote speakers, panelists, and symposia organizers. How about celebrate Black engagement by Black scholars? Some of y'all may have recently seen, for instance, the NIH report that shows that Black scholars are funded at a much lower clip relative to their white counterparts. And that's in large part due to the fact that Black-led grants have strong community engagement. So we can't talk about being about justice work, being about equity work, and then not do these things. We have to lead with understanding how we even change the system of evaluation, not just publish or perish, but making sure that the biodiversity and the ecosystem of all peoples within our academic halls promotes all pieces of the science, not just some. And that means reassessing our roots as well. So I have photos here for you of Charles Henry Turner to the left and a painting of George Washington Carver on the right. For those of you that are animal behaviorists, you may or may not already know of the stories and the work that Charles Henry Turner has put in. For instance, we have the Charles Henry Turner Award in ABS. Charles Henry Turner was influential, incredibly influential, for putting together a lot of the syntheses for understanding individual variation in animal personalities, heritability of behavior, animal cognition, right? That Nico Tinbergen and Conrad Lorenz got a lot of credit for, but were late to the game. Charles Henry Turner didn't get any of that credit because he grew up in a segregated America, and much of his work was relegated to the margins. George Washington Carver, most of y'all probably know about, say, all of the work he did with peanuts, right? And how he made several different uses of peanuts and peanut oil and peanut butter. That is perhaps one of the most trivial of all of his accomplishments, because he was one of the leaders in the fight for environmental justice before it even had a term. Before he even had a term, he was fighting for farmers' rights, and specifically for the rights of Black farmers to own and cultivate their own land, to have food sovereignty, how to grow and rotate crops, how to grow a diversity of crops in order to maintain pollination services and ecosystem services, how to think about urban sustainability. He was on that tip way before Al Gore was on it, but he was scrubbed from the record books and just relegated to the dude that did peanut butter. We have an obligation to understand our history so that way it informs our present, so we make better decisions to diversify our own halls. And with that, one of the last two slides I want to share with y'all, again, another pop culture reference, and I'm assuming y'all watch this movie, and if not, you really got homework like that you need to do today. This photo was taken from the very first Iron Man movie. And it's in the post-credit scene after Tony Stark tells the world he's Iron Man, he's hopped up, he thinks he's what to the earth. And then Nick Fury just strolls into his house, right? Dismantles his security system because it ain't what, and says, "You think you're the only superhero in the world, Mr. Stark? You've become part of a bigger universe. You just don't know it yet." So this is my call to y'all. I've just now given you a talk about how we can leverage our ability to do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work, to speak with our social scientist neighbors, to think about how we even do our sampling design. Say, for instance, you work in a city and you only sample in the richest parts of a city. You're only getting half of the picture, and it's super incomplete. I've known way too many studies that have done that and said, like, oh, look, this is the biology of the city, and this is how different they are from non-urban systems. That's not going to cut it anymore. Being able to survey the entire landscape is important, because that's the only way we're going to be effective at fighting and mitigating the problematic effects of climate change and the climate crisis, as well as the global loss of biodiversity across our planet. And I started this entire journey through the eyes of the animals. So apologies ahead of time. This video is a little choppy. It's old. It's from 2013. But I did the majority of my graduate work at this captive coyote facility in Millville, Utah. And this video of this puppy that I'm showing you right now is of a puppy that's maybe no more than 10, 15 feet away from me. We definitely dubbed this individual as bold. They are not supposed to be this close to you, right? I'm in here just trying to collect fecal samples from the animals. And this puppy, who we affectionately named Cal, for those of you that are fans of DC, you'll know that Kal-El is the birth name of Clark Kent, aka Superman, because this dude was straight up fearless. Like, this puppy was super fearless. He's nonchalantly just sniffing in here. You're like, okay, whatever. I see this dude. I don't really care that he's here. I pan over to the rest of the family though, and you see the rest of the family is a lot further away than Cal is. They're like, you got this, Cal. We're gonna hang back here, man. So for me, I started out being academically raised as a behavioral ecologist, thinking about the behavior of the animals and how it relates to how they relate to their environment and how they relate to people, which led me to think about what are the mechanisms that shape those behaviors, specifically endocrine or physiological mechanisms. And from much of the literature, y'all know, if you study ecophysiology, you know that the environment is really important in that, right? So environmental heterogeneity is really important in influencing the mechanisms that influence the behavior. All right, well, in cities are inherently heterogeneous, right? But why are they heterogeneous? How are they heterogeneous? It's not because it was just random. Somebody made a decision to put certain resources in one place and no resources in the other. And that accumulated over time. For those of you that are evolutionary biologists, right? Evolutionary history of people in cities, also important, even if it's only 100 years ago, even if it's only 50, 20, 10 years ago, because that history dictates how my animals move through the landscape, dictates who they interact with and how those interactions go down. So if I am trying to understand the city through the eyes of my animal, combining that with my experience of being a Black man in America, I can't not see how inequality shapes the ecological landscape and therefore shapes the way in which we do our jobs. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all of the collaborators that have worked with us on all of the things, all of the UW collaborators that worked on many aspects of this talk. Point Defiant Zoo and Aquarium folks that we work with in the Grit City Carnivore Project, all of our UN collaborators that have been helping with the multi-city investigation work, our Socio-eco-evo and RCN collaborators that have been putting together many of these syntheses that y'all have seen of late, the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences here at UW-Tacoma, all of our community partners, and then all of y'all that came for the talk today. And with that, I'll open for any questions y'all may have.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that amazing and powerful talk. And we do have some time for questions. I have a lot of questions, but we'll open it up for, if you have questions for Chris, you can type them in the chat. You can use the raise hand function, and we can proceed that way. Yeah, so, all right, so Anna, do you want to, I see your hands raised, do you want to pop in and ask Chris your question?
Sure, I can just, yeah, I was too lazy to type it in the chat, sorry. Thank you for that talk, that was great. I'm actually in Chicago right now, so it was nice to like have that little connection. But I was wondering, like, looking at where, you know, more like wildlife habitat is in cities, obviously you think more green space and stuff like that. So I'm wondering, from those camera trap studies, are you finding that like larger wildlife is in like higher income neighborhoods, or is it, do you know what I mean? Like, what is that? How does the wildlife camera trapping relate to the inequities and sort of socioeconomic division in cities? Or do you not have that data yet?
No, yeah, so we do have those data. We actually are getting ready to submit the luxury effect paper here pretty soon, likely by next week. So of the 20 cities that had data for the luxury effect analysis, certainly there are no universal truths, but there are certain species that are more heavily influenced by socioeconomic gradients than others. So deer, bobcats, mountain lions, black bear, those tend to be the ones that are heavily influenced by socioeconomic gradients, but they're also heavily influenced by urbanization, period. So that there's that convolution of where different areas are urbanized, how urbanized they are, and how wealthy those areas are. But also, as I mentioned, sometimes we see positive relationships, but sometimes we see neutral relationships where the number of species that we detect on cameras don't change at all. It should be noted that most of, say, like the natural areas and preserves where we have cameras are in those wealthier neighborhoods. And when we're creating our transects, we try and find green spaces that, even if they're relatively small and they're not considered to be parks, we put cameras there anyway. So for instance, we'll have cameras in these large nature preserves, similar to like Chicago, but then we'll have cameras in between two high rises that have small strips of green space that are fenced off. And you would expect nothing to ever get there. And we put cameras there too. So we get raccoons, we get cats, we get rats, we get deer sometimes that walk through those areas, and they're gated. So we try and lead with if there's a little bit of green and there's a tree and we can hide the camera well enough, we won't put it there. But there are certain instances where species richness doesn't change, but community assemblage does. So that means the wealthier areas you're in, maybe you get a bobcat or two. Maybe if you're in the Pacific Northwest, you get a long-tailed weasel, which are pretty rare to get on camera. But then you get into the more urbanized areas or the low-income areas of the city, you're only getting Norway rats, you're only getting raccoons, you're only, if you get lucky, you get deer, and that's it. Now, there are 3 species in each of those areas, but the community assemblage is very different. So we noticed that as well in our analysis.
All right, there are a few coming in the chat. I'm gonna go to the chat and then I'll come back to you, Ben. I see your hand raised. All right, so Syria says, awesome talk, thanks so much. I'm curious about gentrification. Do we have data on how the ecology of wildlife in historically low income neighborhoods changes as the area becomes gentrified?
Hey, Syria, good to hear from you. And the hope is that, yes, we do. So the UN network is working on an analysis right now to take a look at that. Many folks in urban studies, critical race theory, have already developed very solid ironclad methods to be able to understand gentrification. And we have a lot of cameras that are up in many of the areas that have already been gentrified in many of our cities. So we're trying to see whether or not there is this correlation between areas that were gentrified, and then over time, do we see any increases in species? So we're taking both a spatial and a temporal approach. Don't have any answers yet. There hasn't been anybody that's taken a look at this at all. So certainly I'd be curious even to what it looks like in the city of Detroit, which is actively being gentrified in certain regions because of changes in the way in which, say, economy, business, politics are influencing how cities are built and where they're built. So all of that stuff is going to be real interesting.
All right, Ben Dancer, do you want to pop in and with your question?
Yeah. Hey, Chris. Great talk.
Hey, Ben.
So I'm interested in thinking about bioaccumulation of the toxicants and other things that are present across urbanized landscapes. And yeah, I'm just wondering about if you all have done anything related to the accumulation of toxicants, particularly in carnivores that might live in these different types of landscapes, and whether they're more prevalent in some areas versus others, or in certain species or anything like that.
That's a great question, Ben. Hopefully that is the answer. So I have a graduate student when I moved to Berkeley who's going to be doing just that. So seeing whether or not within city variation and bioaccumulation of toxicants is related to historical legacies of oppression within the city. So yeah, one of the graduate students who just signed on a couple of weeks ago to join the lab, which I'm super excited about, is very much engaged in some of that work already.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question, and this came to me from Peter Pelletier. So, hi Chris, fantastic talk. It seems there's been a long history of only finding ecology outside of cities and avoiding studying urban ecology. I'm curious what may account for the bias against urban ecology or studying urban spaces.
Yeah, a lot of it is historical. So we would oftentimes see cities as these wastelands, not only because we thought, well, all these built environments take away or degrade the environmental resources necessary for organisms to live in, but because there was, a lot of bias towards people that live in cities. Think about how cities and their creation was meant to be able to house and have many peoples, but residential segregation continued to drum on. So folks outside of the city and folks that would leave the city due to like white flight or otherwise and go to the suburbs, they would deem the city to be always hazardous or unfit to live in. Many people still to this day think that cities are inherently dangerous, are inherently gang ridden. So all of those, right, those unconscious biases fed into us as maybe like ecologists, our forefathers and foremothers, thinking like, well, we don't want to study stuff in the city because the city's already degraded anyway. Here's the thing. Yeah, cities may take out some resources, but in certain respects, many cities are in biodiversity rich regions. So if you're a conservation biologist, at a certain point, you have to study cities because many of the species that we want to conserve are at this juxtaposition of like where human settlements are and where their prime habitat is. And that's not going to change. We're just going to get more and more urbanized the longer this persists, which means that, well, like we have to study urban systems. I will also put a just like random plug. I'll say that if you work in an urban system, it's the one system you can work in where you could like do your work, go grab something to eat, grab a beer, go back out into the field and sleep in your own bed. That's pretty amazing. And when you have kids, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. Like I get to bring them out into the field whenever they want to come. My 5-year-old has been setting up cameras with me since he was 3 months old. So that's a plug for urban ecology.
Yeah, Chris, again, thank you so much for your time today and this wonderful talk. It's been a real pleasure. And for those of you in the audience, if you are interested, popping your audio on, we can give Chris a round of applause. And yeah, thank you all for attending as well.
Thanks for having me, y'all. This was awesome.
All right.
Shane, it was a pleasure, man. Hopefully we get a chance to like actually be in person with each other sometime in the near future. That would be fun.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
hopefully that's coming soon. But yeah, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So,
And
have you already moved down to Berkeley, or is that's coming up soon?
coming up soon. So no, not yet. I still am teaching remotely for this upcoming quarter at UW-Tacoma, and then we make the move in May. So
Yeah.
it's funny, I'm working 2 jobs, but from the same bedroom.
Yeah.
So like working, getting all the stuff for Berkeley set up, but then also getting all the stuff for UW-Tacoma set up at the same time. And it's a lot, but it'll
Yeah.
be so nice when we get down to California. I'm so excited.
Yeah, well, I mean, good luck with that move. That's coming. That's happening soon.
Happening soon.
Yeah, that's
I'm
really
going to let you guys continue your conversation if you need to. Just again, Chris, you'll see an email come from the university just to gather your personal information for the payment. So,
For sure.
and if you ever have any questions, please feel free to contact me.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Shane, it was a real pleasure. It was good to see you, man. I'm gonna go grab something to eat
do
and give the kiddos a hug. But yeah, let's catch up soon.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again.